And welcome back. Well, with more than 2 million supporters, Food and Water Watch fights for safe food, clean water, and a livable climate for all. Now, they protect people from corporations and other destructive economic interests, putting profit ahead of everything else while organizing people around the country to build political power. Joining me now to share a little bit more, we got the Northeast Region Director of Food and Water. We're pleased, Food and Water Watch, I should say, Alex Beecham. And we thank you so much, Alex, for being with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks. And so when we talk about some of the things that you are particularly interested in and deal with, I know that one of the things you'd like to see is the dealing when it comes to fossils and fossil fuels. When we talk about fossil fuels statewide, you'd like to see a statewide ban on fossil fuels, in buildings.
Yeah, that's right. So we're fighting for a ban on fossil fuels in new buildings throughout the state. This is something that New York City already passed just this past December. And so the goal now is to take it statewide. Taking it statewide would be really significant. So it would triple the climate impact of New York City's law and drastically slash greenhouse gas emissions from our homes, from our buildings. So we're hopeful we can get it done and pushing really hard to get it done in the state budget, which is due any day now.
Yeah. And so when we talk about actually the ban of these fuels, give us a little bit more for viewers who may not be so familiar as to why this is so important.
Yeah. So a lot of times people think of, vehicles or power plants or things like that as the biggest source of emissions. But our buildings are some of the biggest source of emissions throughout the state. And in fact, New York State has more pollution from buildings than any state in the country. In part because they're really big, dense, large buildings across the state. So, and because we're a cold weather state, we rely a lot on largely natural gas. Some people are still on oil, which is even worse. But we rely a lot on either oil or natural gas to heat our homes, for cooking, for all of that, right? So the goal here is to shift all of that to all electric buildings. And in doing that, you not only slash greenhouse gas emissions, which we know we need to do on a global scale to combat the climate crisis, but they're really immediate health gains as well. So there's lots of new studies coming out about just how bad natural gas is in your home, and particularly the stove. So there's big respiratory problems, much higher asthma rates. And so you'd have not only this big climate impact, but immediate health benefits from banning fossil fuels in new buildings. And I keep saying new because that's really what we're talking about, right? The easiest first step is to stop it in the buildings we're building now and stop making the problem worse. Ultimately, we need to transition all of it, right? But that second piece is harder. At a minimum, we ought to stop making the problem worse. And so that's where the fight is now.
And so as we look right now, a lot of the talk in the nation centers on climate change and the need to address climate change, how real it is. But when we talk to elected officials, sometimes it seems as though many are slow to respond or even slow to recognize the fact of climate change is happening all around us. How do you assess our leaders right now and the reception of just the whole climate change conversation?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm hopeful that it'll shift this year, but to be honest, at the state level, I think we've had painfully slow progress over the last several years. And part of the problem is it's difficult to think about climate change in the abstract, right? It is this big kind of existential civilization level threat. It's perhaps a little bit easier when you take it closer to home, right? So this isn't some theoretical thing. We're already dealing with this. A bunch of people died in Queens 6-7 months ago, this past August, when we had huge storms and a bunch of basements flooded. So this is happening to New Yorkers now, right? Storms made worse by climate change are killing people now, and there's lots of impacts, less dire than that. So I think the more we can make it real, the more we can bring it home to New York. And we've seen it, not only in that crisis, but obviously, we're only a few years removed from Hurricane Sandy, which we all remember the devastation that wrought across the city in multiple boroughs. So my hope is that as we continue to organize, as we continue to build power, and as the threat becomes clear that it's not just some theoretical thing, but something that is right now, that we'll get. But with that said, several years, this legislature in New York has done essentially nothing on climate. This policy is a significant thing on the table. This is the biggest thing Governor Hochul Speaker Hastie and Majority Leader Stuart Cousin this year to stop climate change in the state. So pushing them to do it, because we've had now a couple years of inaction since they passed a landmark climate law several years back. So been sitting on their hands. It's time to take real action and stop just talking about it.
As you said, budget is right around the corner right here. Literally not right around the corner, but at the doorstep. Are you optimistic that we'll see some things in regards to this go in your favor?
Yeah, I'm optimistic. The question is what it is. So the governor put a gas ban in her budget. That's good. The timeline is unacceptably long. So she wants to wait 5 years in her budget to ban gas in new buildings. The Senate took much stronger action starting in 2024. That's what we want to see. We want to hold the 2024 date. And then the Assembly didn't do anything. So you have 2 out of the 3, and the hope is that you can get something. The question is whether we can hold Governor Hochul to that 2024 date. I'm optimistic we can. I think she's feeling the pressure from activists. You know, we've had a bunch of events at her office, both in Albany and in New York City, one just the other day. So I'm hopeful that she's feeling the pressure, but we'll see whether she sides with the people or the real estate industry and their friends in the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, I know that from your perspective, incinerators are not the most healthiest. I'll talk about that in a minute. Can you give me an idea about how many people are still using incinerators today in the state?
Well, when you say incinerators, you mean like how many are using fossil fuels in their homes? Is that what you're saying? Yeah. So for like gas stoves or heating. It's the vast majority. So I don't know the number off the top of my head, but the vast majority of buildings in New York are using fossil fuels. And again, this policy isn't even addressing that. It's just talking about new buildings. So it's saying, look, we should stop making the problem worse. And it's much, much easier to build a new building all electric for a whole variety of reasons. The building envelope is different. They're way more efficient than older buildings. And so the cost savings is the cost difference between transitioning an old building and building a new building all electric is pretty significant. But right now it's the vast majority. It's got to be 9 out of 10, maybe more than that. Almost everybody is using fossil fuels to heat their homes now.
Yeah. Educate us a little bit about fracking. I think that some of our viewers may not be so familiar with fracking, but we do understand that there's some concern when it comes to fracking and how this plays a part in all that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's a good point. So when we talk about gas, really, basically all of that is fracked gas now, right? So particularly in New York, where we're getting a lot from Pennsylvania. So fracking is this drilling technique, right? So what it is you shoot millions of gallons of water laced with chemicals into the ground at like really high velocity, and then it fractures the rock. So the gas is inside the rock. That's why it's called fracking. So you shoot this down up to a mile deep into the ground, you fracture the rock, and then the gas comes out. There's a whole bunch of problems with this. Not only does it obviously make climate change worse, but there's huge issues with water contamination, both from the chemicals and from the actual gas getting into people's water supply, getting into the groundwater. There are waste problems, myriad other problems. One really exciting thing is that several years ago, following a really enormous grassroots movement that we were proud to be a part of, then Governor Cuomo banned fracking across New York. So we don't do it here, right? We don't allow the extraction in New York State. We are, however, incredibly reliant on fracked gas that we're importing from Pennsylvania and from other states around the country. So there's also sort of a hypocrisy there, right? That we're saying, look, this is too dangerous for New York, but we're happy to use it and sort of have Pennsylvania or whatever other state as the kind of sacrifice zone. But, you know, as a state, as a government, we have said this isn't safe. There was a whole long review process, not only around environmental problems, but around health impacts as well. And the result of both of those was this isn't safe. We can't make it safe for the environment. We can't make it safe for people's health. So, you know, if it's not safe in New York, it's not safe next door in Pennsylvania either. But that's what we've done, right? We've become increasingly reliant on Pennsylvania gas over the last several years.
Yeah. And so we hear a lot of marketing that's going on out there, and a lot of people are paying attention to some of the marketing and the advertising that's out there. Talk to us about what you're seeing by way of marketing to the average New Yorker and what we should be paying attention to when we see these marketing platforms that are really speaking in favor of.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because on this effort to ban gas in new buildings, we've seen literally the oil industry, the American Petroleum Institute, who's kind of like the big lobbying arm of, the biggest oil companies in the world, Exxon, Chevron, all of them sort of use EPI, the American Institute is the kind of trade group. So anyway, that group has bought a bunch of Facebook social media ads across New York, which we think are deeply misleading, saying this will raise prices, the sky is falling, they're going to tear out your gas stoves. None of that stuff is true, but they're using it to scare people into calling their legislators and saying, don't do this. So, in many ways, it's par for the course. We saw the same thing at the city level, where API attacked that bill as well, and we were able to overcome it. And I think I'm hopeful it'll play out the same way. I mean, at the end of the day, obviously the oil industry has a lot of money, basically unlimited budget. They don't have any people though, right? So the entire fight kind of boils down to like whether our people are more powerful than the other side's money. And I think on this issue, we will be, because we've had a huge outpouring of grassroots support for months now. And that's why we got it in 2 of the 3 House budgets, and hope that we get it all the way through any day now. So we'll see.
Yeah, you got corporate money out there, no question about it.
Yeah.
It's an uphill battle anytime that you're going against corporate money. But I think you spoke a little bit to this, but I'll ask you to elaborate a little bit more, because one thing that is on your side is that grassroots effort. And we do know that grassroots, for those people who don't know, that's word of mouth, right? Word of mouth really can be a great factor in overcoming this.
Yeah, absolutely. And on our stuff, there's virtually always opposition from the fossil fuel industry on the other side. And it is a real dichotomy, right? Like there aren't people in the streets saying, let's keep burning fossil fuels, right? Like those people don't exist. That's not a thing. What they have is a lot of money to give to campaign contributions, and then obviously a lot of lobbyists in the halls of Albany, but they don't have any real people out there advocating for change. We do, right? So there's people outside Governor Hochul's office. There's people doing the kind of hard work of calling their elected officials and saying, you need to get on this bill. There's people doing the kind of like grassroots lobby meetings or district meetings in individual assembly members' offices, to Governor Hochul all the way to the top. So that stuff really adds up and really matters, and is a lot of serious hard work by a lot of serious, New Yorkers who are taking time off work to do this stuff. But it works, and that's the way we banned fracking. That's the way we've stopped a bunch of pipelines across the state. And I think that's the way we're going to ban gas in new buildings statewide. Yeah.
You were able to see success with former Mayor Bill de Blasio's gas ban on New York City. What do you determine to be the thing that's the delay, if you will, between the city and the state? It seemed to go pretty quicker in the city, but when it comes to the state, a hard push.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's right, that it happened at the city first. It was a fight at the city level too, right? We worked most of last year to make that happen, and effort, I guess is what I'd say. But you're right. At the end of the day, Mayor de Blasio and the city council did the right thing at the very last council meeting of the year. I think there's a number of factors. So one is that a lot of other cities around the country have done this. Obviously, New York City's the biggest because we're the biggest city. And one of the only really cold weather cities where it's a little bit harder to do it. But so that's one factor, right? Is a lot of cities have done it. No state has done this yet. And so I think in some ways it's just sort of an easier lift at the city level. That said, I think New York is poised to be the first state, in large part because we won at the city already, right? So you already have the biggest city in the state, and not quite half the population, but a huge portion of the population under this law. So how hard is it then to just expand it statewide is kind of the logic. But yeah, and look, if they did it this year, that's still pretty fast, right? Then what's the difference? It's 5-6 months later. That'd be great. And I think it's relatively likely that we make that happen.
Yeah. If you're just joining us, I'm pleased to be joined by Alex Beacham, who's the Northeast Region Director for Food and Water Watch. Been talking about gas, fracking, what's going on in the city and the state. And Alex, for a few moments, I want to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about Food and Water Watch for many people who may not be so familiar with your organization. Give us a little insight into the work that you do.
Yeah. So, we're a national environmental group. We're really focused on organizing, right? So we put most of our resources into organizing at the local level. to build power that we think it takes to overcome opposition about with the oil industry fighting us on this bill. But on our issues, that's kind of always the case, right? So we try to take on big policy matters that are always going to have entrenched opposition on the other side. And so I think the way to overcome that is by organizing locally, by creating grassroots action to overcome the corporate money. And so, as the name implies, we do a lot of work on both food and water issues, all kind of fighting against the corporate consolidation or abuse of the food industry on the food side. And then on water, we've done a lot of work fighting water privatization. So like when a town or a city tries to sell the water utility or the wastewater utility to a private company. In New York City, I think that's really unlikely to happen, but we've done a lot of work around New York, in Westchester, Rockland County, where we're fighting a big privatization battle now. And then Long Island, where we just won a battle to take back the water system from private companies. So that was an extraordinary win and years of work going into it. And then, as we've talked about today, an increasing amount of our work is around fighting the climate crisis. And we, I think, see our niche as sort of fighting the fossil fuels side of that, right? That we need to halt the expansion of fossil fuels if we're ever going to get where we need to go. And so that, for years in New York, that was the fracking campaign, and then has kind of evolved to this campaign fighting power plants, fracked gas pipelines, and then now this kind of housing piece to ban gas in new buildings. But to us, that's all kind of an extension of fracking, right? It's all kind of one thing, either from the extraction to the transportation of it to where you ultimately burn it.
Yeah, I remember for a while there was a huge, ignorance, if you will, to climate change. I remember Al Gore running and talking about climate change, and a lot of people looking at him with two heads. And since that, a lot has changed. From your perspective, how do you line up with people who are now getting on board with climate change? Because for a lot of people, they caught the bus, but caught it rather late, and some still have yet to get on.
Yeah, no, that's true for sure. I mean, I will say, I've done this work, I guess 12 years at Food and Water Watch and some years before that. And the difference is pretty stark, right? I think for years, we almost tried not to lead with climate change. You try to lead with the water impacts or the health impacts of a certain issue. And I think it's important we still do that, right? That pollution doesn't only matter because of climate change. It also affects people's health. It creates respiratory problems. Air pollution is one of the biggest health problems we're facing as a country, and certainly in New York, it's worse than most places. So it's important to do all that stuff. But I will say, I think the ground is shifting a lot. People's eyes don't glaze over when you talk about climate change anymore. People get that it's a real threat, and I think that's a sign of progress. From my perspective, our elected officials have not kept pace with where the public is. I think the public has become increasingly alarmed about this, especially in New York. And we've seen too little. There's a lag from I think elected officials rarely lead, they follow, right? And so it takes them a little bit longer usually, but the hope is that as that public consciousness has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, and people have gotten, frankly, more angry about the level of inaction, that we'll finally see something real. But it's been frustrating in some respects and then gratifying in others, because you're right, more people are into it, more people are aware of the problem, and more people are not just aware of it, but taking real action, demanding that their leaders do something to combat the climate crisis.
So how do people become more involved? I mean, you've got a great organization where you do some grassroots work and getting people mobilized and organized, but how can we see more involvement from the public in connecting with these initiatives?
Yeah, so the main thing people can do is go to our website, which is just Food and Water Watch. So just written all out, foodandwaterwatch.org. Tons of opportunity there to take action, at the federal level, all the way down to the local New York City, and sometimes even more local than that, borough or district specific level. So yeah, that's the main thing people can do. Go to foodandwaterwatch.org and sign up to receive updates, and then you'll hear about what's what we've got going on anyway.
All right. Well, Alex, we're going to leave it there. Alex Beecham, who's our Northeast Region Director for Food and Water Watch, joining us here on the Social Justice Forums, talking about fracking, talking about the New York City gas ban, and really a cleaner climate for New York, and not just New York, but these whole United States. Alex, thank you so much for coming and sharing with us here today.
Yeah, thanks so much.